All right. I'll speak first in Spanish and then in English, just to welcome the audience. Buenas tardes. Quisiera darle la bienvenida a nuestros queridos invitados, así como la audiencia. Es realmente un placer para nosotros tenerlos aquí en una discusión sobre un libro de autoría de Peter Gabel que será próximamente publicado en español por la Universidad de los Andes y Siglo del Hombre Editores, por una traducción magnífica de Diego López. Las dinámicas de la sesión serán las siguientes. En primera instancia, Peter hará una exposición de los elementos centrales de su libro, 20 minutos. Posteriormente, Diego López y Duncan Kennedy presentarán sus comentarios. Cada uno tendrá 15 minutos para cumplir con este objetivo. Posteriormente, tendremos alrededor de 40 minutos para una discusión con la audiencia. La audiencia podrá presentar sus preguntas de manera oral, simplemente levantando la mano, o por escrito a través del chat. Ustedes quieren hacer las preguntas en español, por favor háganlo, y nosotros haremos nuestro mejor esfuerzo por traducirlas de manera tan precisa como sea posible. Reitero, bienvenidos a todos y a todas. Es un gusto tenerlos hoy con nosotros. Well, I would like first to welcome our dear guests, Professors Peter Gabel, Duncan Kennedy, and Diego López. Peter Gabel is a former professor and president of the New College of California. Duncan Kennedy is professor at Harvard Law School, and Diego López is professor at Universidad de los Andes, School of Law. It's really a pleasure to have you here. The dynamics of the session will be the following. First, Peter, the author of the book that we will discuss today and that will be published in Spanish very soon by Uniandes and Siglo del Hombre Editores, will present the key elements of his books, the key ideas that give structure to his book in 20 minutes. Afterwards, Duncan Kennedy and Diego López will offer some comments on the book. Each will have 15 minutes to present his comments. Afterwards, and for around 40 minutes, we will have a discussion with the audience. The audience can ask their questions orally, verbally, just raising your hand, or you can ask your questions via the chat in a written way. You can ask the questions in Spanish, and we will do our best to translate these questions in most precise way. So again, welcome to our dear guests and welcome to the audience. And Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can only see a little tiny picture of me or not. Also, I seem to be admitting people to the session. I'm getting a prompt saying, do I admit this person? Do I admit that person? So I'm just admitting whoever appears on my screen. But
don't worry, Peter, we will do that. You just focus on your presentation.
Okay. Well, so you see me in a little strange box, but that's all right. It's related to what I'm going to talk about, which is this. So we, in this terrible situation in the world today in Ukraine, the killing, the rapes, the continuation of a social pathology being enacted before us, with everybody reacting by saying, how can this be happening? And perhaps analyzing it, but then at a deeper level, being appalled by it and in awe of it. So this book, The Desire for Mutual Recognition, Social Movements and the Dissolution of the False Self, is a social theory that argues, it doesn't really argue, but it tries to evoke the necessity for reconnecting the spiritual dimension of existence with social theory. And by the spiritual dimension of existence, I do not mean religion per se, or any kind of private pursuit of spirituality, but rather the spiritual longing, the longing at the heart of the human being, a social longing that is not being recognized within the culture, and that from which we are alienated and separated. And that social longing is central to what it means to be a human person, and its illumination is necessary to understanding and healing the conditions that can produce and reproduce the Ukraine situation again and again in our world. So the central idea of the book is that all human beings desire mutual recognition, that is, long for the experience of affirming the other and being fully affirmed by the other in who we really are, actually being seen for who we really are in our being. Martin Buber did beautifully characterize an aspect of this in his description of I and thou. And here again, I'm trying to reach all of you through this small box and with various prompts coming to me as I do it. It's a challenge, but the essence of the point can be done through this space, which is we all long for to see and be seen as who we really are. We know this every time a newborn child appears, every time a child is born and we encounter a newborn child, because of the fullness of the presence of that child in his or her face, and the way that it is out of our own feeling of separation or isolation. I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but I've lost the picture. Okay, I'm back now, so I hope you can hear me. Can you?
Yes, Peter.
All right. So this desire for authentic mutual recognition, involving the vulnerability of one's being revealed to the other and entering into a relationship of co-presence with another human being, that is a social desire within all of us, and yet we live in a world in which that desire is denied. By denied, I mean, well, for example, we pass each other with blank gazes on the street. When we do that, if we're aware, we are actually withdrawn into ourselves, averting our eyes or glancing off of the eyeballs of the passing person, but that really captures a rotating separation in which people are living within telephone booths of their own mind and spirit. And that's one manifestation of what I'm calling the denial of this desire for mutual recognition. Another aspect, and much more important in some ways, is the construction of the persona or the false self. And here I always use the example, it's very strong in the United States, of the newscaster who appears on the nightly news and talks like this and assures everyone and moves on to the next story. The Red Sox win, a fire in Dorchester, back in a moment. With his gestures delayed slightly, you can see that there's a non-synchronization between the gesture and the impulse, that it's being enacted, the role or persona is being enacted, and that enactment involves a withdrawal of the presence of the person from one's social manifestation, a withdrawal of the presence of the person, a throwing up of an attempt to be anonymous, that is, a screen of a role, which the newscaster simultaneously communicates at a meta level that this is who I really am. In other words, I'm not playing a role, I'm not playing a part, I am this person who is inhabiting this artificial persona or false self. That is the element of denial, the element in which one cannot break through or see through or enter and come to know the artificiality of the persona. And what's behind it is a fear of humiliation, a fear of actually being seen, and inhabiting a culture in which that fear is internalized across identities and classes, across what we call social structures, which I, in the book, call spinning tops for reasons I can talk about if we have time. And but the central point is that the persona reflects a cultural timbre or level of manifestation of being that rotates and that manifests itself in a rotating fashion, in a patterned rotating fashion across the culture. Of course, counter to that is the longing for mutual recognition that always offers hope and possibility in every interaction and in every social moment and in apparently very closed social institutions to make changes that bring into being a more humane and just and a co-present, loving world, which is the world that we all aspire to. I'll just give one example quickly of something extraordinary that happened in San Francisco when there was a major earthquake and part of the biggest bridge here, the Bay Bridge, collapsed. And the electricity didn't work, televisions didn't work, and people ran out to the street corners to share battery-powered TVs together. And the newscasters that were inhabiting that socially separating role were bursting into tears, talking just like humans about what the actual experience we were all having was, in a way that pulled us into a feeling of community rather than by a kind of centripetal, I think it is, force, pushing us back into our couches in a state of a presumed isolation, withdrawnness, and separation. So this example of the newscaster is reflected in our own selves, in the way that we are conditioned from birth as we're brought into a world carrying forward a legacy of this kind of fear of the other, fear of being fully seen by the other, that's transmitted through the family, through the street culture, and as I show in the book, through legal institutions, through the schooling process, the reproduction of this kind of social separation. There's one example here that I sometimes refer to, which is the local coffee shop has a giant mirror in it. And every day, everybody uses the same coffee shop, but every single person who comes in there checks themselves out in the mirror. And at the same time that they're relating to whatever's happening in the coffee shop, they are managing their outer selves, this outer conditioned persona that their sense of worth is invested in because we must become the way that we are recognized, because they have been recognized in relationship to it. And so they're constantly trying, we are constantly trying to match up to it. And so this floating outer self that I call the false self, that is an enactment, a social enactment passed around from person to person, in its gossamer, empty quality, in its lack of groundedness in who we actually are, leads to a kind of, I guess it's sort of a personal tragedy for everyone to have to cope with, which is the pursuit of becoming the perfect other, the other that would not be vulnerable to the humiliation that the other's gaze otherwise would contain. And so people live out their lives in pursuit of perfecting that combination of internalized roles that would represent an ideal of themselves in their minds, but actually isn't what they or we want. Because the longing within all of us is to allow this to be dissolved so that we can truly enter into each other's presence as fully present beings, seeing one another as we actually are. Now this, at the individual level, is reflected then also in the formation of groups and in the group level. And this is more relevant to the Ukraine reference at the beginning, because the failure to be seen and the withdrawnness of one's being leads to a longing to identify with and be connected to other people that's already there, of course. That longing and desire becomes attached to imaginary communities that represent in the collective, in the we, in the false we, as I call it, what the quest for the perfect other represents within the self. So in the United States, we had, Donald Trump as president for those years with his theme of Make America Great Again, which you may have some equivalent in Colombia, or I'm actually quite interested in that. But Make America Great Again was an imaginary construct, and you can see it particularly in Trump, the fear of humiliation underneath it all, that the we would become greater and greater because it's always in danger of deflating. And why would it be in danger of deflating? Because it is not substantial. It's a collective imaginary and not rooted itself in being. So it's a constant aspect of nationalism and patriotism to try and reinflate what is in fear of constantly being deflated. Because if it were deflated, what would happen is not the loss of national identity as such, but the revelation of the longings that is masking, the longing within to actually see and be seen by the person next to you, by the person in the room with you, by actual humans in whom you are in relationship to. Just in passing, certainly, let's say Vladimir Putin has a fantasy of recreating the Russian bear, the Russian Empire, making Russia great again. Well, it's not about making Russia great again. It's about constructing a collective imaginary that substitutes for an inner vulnerability and longing that is not being seen or recognized by others. So, so in this short time, maybe I'll just say, so what we have is a social process in which the fundamental structure of separation at the base of it all leads to this psycho-spiritual distortions like hyperinflated pathological nationalism and other forms of imaginary collective identity that rotates as each person sees the other acting that way and sees that's the only way to become part of the group. internalizes that and makes it a part of him or herself, because there doesn't appear to be any other option. That is, the true longing, the deep longing to see, be seen, and be present with, fully present with the other, doesn't appear to have any outlet in people's lives that are, who, to the extent that we are entrapped in these patternings of separation. And so adapting to the pattern of separation is the way of being with others, even though it is a way of not being with others at the same time. And so I'll just say, I'm not sure how much time I've taken, but I'll just say, in essence, the second part of the book tries to analyze how this complex dynamic is enacted across the society, in politics, law, education, the family, the life on the street, as I say. But the really central moral point of the book and hopeful point of the book is the social movements, is the possibility that always exists, that the desire for mutual recognition will break out in a social form through a social movement. And when that kind of rising happens, people come to recognize each other very quickly and suddenly through a kind of ricochet that can happen very quickly, move very quickly from city to city, sometimes through the media. That can actually occur very rapidly, that experience of a true we being born. And of course, when people have that experience, they feel a fullness that they have not felt in all the years of existing in the socially separated kind of entropy of everyday life. So maybe I'll stop there and say, one of the concepts in the book is the concept of the moat. And the moat is the separation between our true being, our true social being, and our social selves. That moat that's born of the legacy of fear of the other, and that actually produces all these wars, violence, pathologies of gender, many, many things. In the rising period of social movements, the moat can be dissolved and people can come into each other's presence. And of course, the book is in significant part about that experience, about how it occurs in real situations, and also about the limitations of prior movements, about ways that up to now, the movement has lacked confidence in itself, and so has not produced a form of activism that can thaw the legacy of the false self and the pain that has shaped it, and foster mutuality of presence in a way that can be sustained over time. This is the big spiritual challenge of activism. And so I'll stop there. That's the essence of it.
Thank you, Professor Gabel. Now, Professor Kennedy will present his reactions to Professor Gabel's book and presentation. Thank you.
So first of all, I'm delighted to be here. I'm really glad to have been invited to comment on Peter's book and to be invited by Daniel and Diego, who are both people for whom I have a lot of respect. So it's thrilling to me that they are actually involved in the publication of the book, translation into Spanish. I think I want to begin by just saying about the book that I love this book. I just think it's a fantastically good book. A book that in some sense represents one of the best products of a particular American, United Statesian cultural, political development of the end of the 20th century, let's say. And I guess I want to start by introducing some themes of the book that Peter mentioned. He mentioned one of the things about the book is the style of the book is very unusual. And it's a philosophical conversational style. in which the author on the page is unfolding his thought in long, linked sentences, which are very much like speech. So you've heard Peter talking the way the book is actually written. But that may strike you as implausible, but I want to begin by reading a passage. I'll read several passages from the book. If I can get it on the chat, which I'm going to do. Here it is. So I'm now going to read a passage from the book that's a perfect example of the style of the book. And then I'm going to suggest that it's also one of the key sentences in the whole book, in so much as you can do that with a whole book. Take a sentence. This sentence is early on in the book. Peter said this already in his presentation. When I speak of re-spiritualizing the world, what I mean is simply that we human beings are bound together by spirit, that there is a vibrant life force that unites us, and that is social in nature, although invisible to the naked objectifying eye, and more, that the longing of this social spirit, the longings of this social spirit are at the core of all human motivation in the realm of politics, economics, psychology, personal life, everything. So that statement, so you can see it, you can see the style. That's all one sentence. What I just read is all a single sentence. And you know, in the usual idea of a style that's based on long flowing sentences, it's usually a stream of consciousness. It's highly subjective. But this very long sentence consists mainly of abstractions, one abstraction after another. But that's nonetheless powerful because it's the opposite of the usual way of constructing from the bottom up our understanding of what it's like for the world to be organized, which is that it's organized into individuals. So we're used to thinking of the world as a construct, an elaborate order that's composed of individuals. And the question is, how do we deal with their relations with each other as autonomous beings? And this is to argue as a premise from the very beginning, that's not the way to understand it. The way to understand is what is happening is an order that's imposed on people who are actually related to each other, not as isolated individuals, but as participants in a single kind of, what shall we say, a social essence, something that is intersubjective, that unequivocally transcends the idea of the isolated self as the necessary unit from which we're going to analyze everything. So the way Peter presented it is strikingly loose and easy as it is when he presents it. But that sentence is all just built down into each phrase contains a refutation of liberal political philosophy. Each phrase in the sentence is a rejection of the core idea of understanding that the role of political philosophy is to rationalize, understand, to derive the ethical consequences of a universe composed of monads who have something in common. They have enough in common to be humans and then to be citizens and be members of families, but the stark initial reality is that. So rejecting that is a very strong move. Now, the mode of rejection could suggest that this truth of intersubjectivity is in itself just such a great thing that we can sort of bask in the reality that we are connected in this deep longing for being together, and that's really the essence. But Peter's actual approach, which he didn't fully convey it in his talk, though I loved his talk, he didn't fully convey it, has a very strong negative dystopian dimension that goes along with and is in the second stage after we've recognized and thought of ourselves as recognize that reality. There's something wrong in his analysis of the social world, there is a fall, something like the fall in biblical images of the fate of man in the Garden of Eden. So the initial presentation is Edenic, but the world is a fallen world. And the fallen world, that is not due to anything it's not due to something diffuse. His idea of the fall is very concrete and specific. And the fall derives from the fact that children in their first experience of adults, so the mother or wherever the first very powerfully, effectively connecting adult is, that there's something already problematic. And here's what he says it is. It's a problem of double messaging of the adult to the child. The core of the double message, this I'm reading, of the adult to the child in the very way the child is at first recognized into social existence is, desire me, but deny that you desire me on pain of the extinction of our connection. Instead, to be with me, you must become the artificial role that I claim I really am and that I claim that you really are. So the role in this case is child or infant. And that's that, again, the fall in this understanding of social existence is something that is, so to speak, impossible to overcome, since everyone, since infancy, is already socialized by their parents and their caretakers into needing to present themselves to the caretaker as what the caretaker expects them to be, namely a child who is a good child, a bad child, caught in the role of childness. So that's a pretty heavy initial negative trip. Second dimension, the fall is the basis, the construction of the family on the basis of these role incumbents is reproduced in every other domain of social existence. So this book is very much like classical European social theoretical accounts, whether Marxism, Althusserian, or Gramscian, but also Freudian psychoanalytic, in that it alleges that a very large part of the whole story reduces to a single key factor that's then elaborated differently in politics. But basically, the isolated selves construct to deal with the pain of being isolated and the fear of being humiliated, things like the nation, which are actually false wholes. So the unity of participating in the nation is based on an illusion of communality dominated by the need for an authority in relation to the state, by the subjection, the voluntary self-subjection to ideologies as requiring that people maintain the pre-existing condition of distance established at the beginning. So the family and the state, the family, again, is an artificially constructed idea that animates people through the ideology of the family, like the ideology of nationalism, to understand themselves as separate in these basic ways and to give up on the aspiration to break through into a deeper connection. So this is very, very dystopian. So against the deep dystopianness of it, Peter constantly affirms every time there's hope. And the hope lies in the fact that the desire for mutual recognition is never actually extinguished. It's ontological to being a human being, that you long right through all the necessity to keep up your role and your appearance of wholehearted participation, your attempt to perfect yourself so that when you look in the mirror, what you'll see is what you think you ought to be. All of those things are against the background of wanting to get through and around. There are various ways that can happen, but the thing that counts here for Peter's overall structure is the insistence that the primary locus of the possibility of getting beyond is social movement, understood as all the different social movements of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So nationalism is not part of it, but even the labor movement is part of it. As the precursor of movement is the labor movement in the modern West, but then it is the women's movement, it's the struggle for racial justice through civil rights movement. It's ecological movement understood through the practices of care for the environment collectively, and also gender rights, the whole array of moments in which people identify to go after some aspect of social existence by affirming that together, by bonding, by organizing themselves on the basis of intersubjective unity, they can do something about it. So that for Peter is the salvific, I love the word salvific possible thing that can happen. Now, the next thing I want to do is to place this theory in the context, in a particular context. So first of all, it's important to understand that the theory is an elaborate meditation on Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, as well as Martin Buber. That's to be expected, but it's also about, it's a development and critique of the Marxist tradition. It's a development and critique of the psychoanalytic tradition encountered in a kind of brutal way through the book. So the book is a primer on 20th century social theory in its most complicated European versions. And it's not amateurish. It's actually an amazing performance, given how much of that tradition he's taken up. Now, one of my big criticisms of the book is that I think he doesn't get the way he ought to get either Marxism or postmodernism, but he has a critique of them, a very elaborate critique of them. It's not as elaborated as it needs to be to kill them dead, but it's an elaborated critique of them. So this book aspires to be a learned book, but it's a learned book of a particular odd kind, representing a conjuncture. And it's could be described this way. It's a reception book. So Diego has written a lot. Maybe one of Diego's obsessions in his youth was reception. So this book fully fits into a Diego López Medina-esque kind of theory of reception. What's received is in the United States, in the American intelligentsia of the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, by an intelligentsia of the production of another European critical theoretical intelligentsia on a completely new scale with a new intensity, unlike anything that had ever happened before in American cultural life. So there are thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of American intellectuals and pseudo-intellectuals and crypto-intellectuals who are feverishly absorbing a mass of European texts, which are each one claiming to be the end of the world, super maestro, rejects everything before, you have to take his theory. But this is a classic process of reception in the context of an impoverished hermeneutic environment in which the receivers have no training in European critical theory and have the experience that we can do whatever we want. We don't care. The European masters are long gone, they're not present, and we can just put them together any way we want. So it's a thrilling moment in American cultural history in which this sub-intelligentsia works reception in an impoverished hermeneutic environment, which permits all kinds of innovations, new things, ridiculous things are written, junk is produced as truth, people worship first Habermas, and then Levinas, and you can't tell who they're gonna, and then Agamben, you can't tell who they're gonna be worshiping next. So this book is in a sense a distillation of that moment. That is, it's not heterogeneous accumulation of elements, it's a theory that confronts the body of European social theory critically from an American point of view. So it's a United States book. It's not Latin American, it's not European, it's United Statesian in this very basic set of two things. First, it receives these European works in spite of the fact that they are rebarbative and repellent from the point of view of many basic American attitudes. They're incomprehensibly elitist. They're hopelessly antagonistic to all forms of popular culture. They are, each one of them is authoritarian, and in its tone and in its inner presence, the presence of the page is a master who's telling you what to think in an unequivocal and very brutal way, and doing it in a language that you will probably not be able to understand. And so what? It's not the business of the master to write so that the peons or the peasants can understand what he's saying. So it's a really, really antagonistic to the American cultural idea of pluralism, openness, etc. Now, moreover, it's arriving in the United States at a moment characterized by three different overlapping things. And this is how so Peter is on the one hand receiving these texts. He's accumulating them in his college dorm room, and then in his, let's say, his hippie encampment, where under the stars, people are singing revolutionary songs. So these things are being researched. Here's what's going on in the United States. Three things. The three things are generational rebellion, the counterculture, and social movement. And these things are nested within each other. So the most general phenomenon is generational rebellion. So the young against the old, just brutally put, is an extraordinarily widespread rebellion. It involves 100 million people. It's not everybody by any means, because there are lots of people who hate it. There are lots of parents who loathe and detest it, obviously, that's always true. There's lots of older people who are just revolted by the generational rebellion, but a very large minority of the young utterly reject the rebellion. They don't like it, they hate it, they love their parents and they worship authority, and they are, in Peter's language, unbelievably, painfully enclosed in the false self apparatus. In Peter's, or mine, I agree with Peter. I mean, this is obviously, what do we know? It's extremely condescending to dismiss, in our case, say a third of our generation as just not getting it. It's absurd to say that, but basically, that's what Peter is saying, and I completely agree with him. So it's not universal, but it's massive youth rebellion. Within the youth rebellion, there is a counterculture, and the counterculture is much more familiar because it has a strong Latin American equivalent, and it's based on particular music, it's based on the sexual revolution, it's based on new cultural styles, it's based on a particular new attitude towards nature, and it is very, very big. The counterculture is a real presence in every big city, and it's there in tiny minoritarian forms everywhere, but it's still not even as big as the generational rebellion. It's much smaller than that, but it's still millions of people. And within that, within the counterculture, very broadly conceived, there is social movement. There's some social movement people who never participated in the counterculture at all, but they would understand themselves as minoritarian within the social movement universe. So the stack here is on background is generational revolt, within which there's counterculture, within which there's social movement. So Peter basically, in that respect, brings to the reception process a strong position that this generational, cultural, political development in the United States is something that we can embrace, that distinguishes us cleanly from European critical theory. Among other things, we think American popular culture, particularly English, Afro-American, American rock and roll, and its subsequent developments as opposed to being garbage, which is the way it's typically regarded by the European critical intelligentsia, is an astonishing cultural accomplishment, by which we don't mean we really like it because it's cool and like that. We actually mean that it is culturally at a very high level. So that's a very strong distinguishing position right away. But then the other thing is, we really don't believe that you can do, the content of the European critical theory is very much, its authoritarian didactic character is deep into it. And it's possible to bring to it a rejection of that element. Is not the universal element. It's universal among those theorists. They're all like that, but it's not intrinsic to the ideas at all. The ideas have enormous liberatory potential if they're brought into conjunction with places where the desire for mutual recognition has worked, has actually been experienced. And in those situations, critical theory is of this type is an essential, extremely important tool to understand what's going on. And now let me just end with the way that works in terms of social movement. Armed with Peter's version of critical social theory, this would be an interpretation of social movement. So social movement is salvific for Peter, true. But just as the desire for mutual recognition experiences the fall, the actual experience of social movement that's part of the generational rebellion, counterculture, and social movement is tragic. So Peter sounded very goody-goody and upbeat in his talk, but as a matter of fact, he's not like that at all. That was an illusion. In fact, his basic theory is that what happened to social movement was a tragic failure of our generation, which we managed to allow to tumble down to the ensuing generations of activism to maintain the kind of social connections within our groups that were necessary for survival against two disastrous things, like the mother's look at the child, which says, don't get too close to me, you're totally close to me, but be a baby still. Against that were inside our own movements, carried over from those experiences, were a failure to crush bureaucracy and a failure to discipline or expel wreckers who couldn't stand any kind of leadership. So within our movement, there was bureaucratization, and there was the very possibility of freedom produced in many people, just a kind of reaction against any form of leadership, a crazy anarchist thing. You put the bureaucrats together with those wrecking anarchists, and basically we fucked up. So what's the answer? There's no answer except this concept, which is familiar in other areas of social theory. I think I would describe Peter's answer as what would be called capacity building. It's like capacity building in social movement. It's not about the program and it's not about the organization. It's building the capacity in the self and in others to deal with the dangers that will happen if we ever get going again from bureaucratization and crazy anarcho anti-leader rage, which will allow us also to deal with those things in ourselves, our longing to routinize liberation and our rebellion against really cooperating with anyone else at all in that. So both in the self and in others. So that's his program, which I think is a great program, and I subscribe to it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Now it's Diego López's turn. Go on, Diego, please.
Okay, thank you, Manuel and Daniel, for the invitation. I want to thank Peter for allowing me to translate the book into Spanish. There's, when Daniel talked in Spanish, he said that it was a very good translation, but then he did not repeat it in English. So I want to make clear that he said it, and thank you for saying that, Daniel. I certainly, it's probably not a good translation, but I try to make it with lots of love and trying to understand the arguments that Peter wrote there. This is the book in English. Peter gave it to me in a meeting of the critical legal scholars in the United States. It was in Princeton just before the pandemic started. He gave it to me. Of course, the title is a bit baffling. The Desire for Mutual Recognition, Social Movements and the Dissolution of the False Self. Of course, I started reading it without knowing what it was all about. But by that time, I was sitting down. The Japanese Zen tradition calls it sazen. They don't like the word meditation. So I read the whole thing while sort of sitting down in sazen, and that helped me a lot to understand the book. It's a weird book, and I would recommend it to our law students for several reasons. It's a book that tells the story, according to Peter, why is it that we live separated from each other with a moat. The word moat is very important in the book. Moat is fosso, like the fosso that encircles the castle, the personal castle in which we live. And the whole book, it's this experience of getting to know how is it that the moat is constructed and we live restricted by it. And at the same time, why there's some sort of hope that we can somehow draw the bridge down to surpass the moat through both personal, political, and social experiences. They are very difficult to attain. We live in a society, in a liberal society, in which the moat actually is constructed through several apparatuses and mechanisms. Those actually are characterized in our society as good. Somehow in the dichotomy between good and bad, they are characterized socially as good. So it's an argument, a very passionate argument to dismount these apparatuses that are in our society characterized as good, and to try to draw down the bridge over the moat and try to reach to somebody else in front of us. That's weird in the law and in legal matters, because somehow the law is one of the main dispositives that we have to create the moat around us, even the very same consciousness of rights. And this creates something difficult to understand, because somehow we talk a lot about the movement for civil rights, the civil rights movement. We talk about and I was thinking about this idea of of civil rights movement, which translated into Latin America into human rights, the human rights movement, the social rights movement. And when I remember the ways in which I explain to my students the idea of movements, Duncan and Peter, the idea of movement seemed to be a cognitive cascade, a normative cascade, the idea of reception, multiplication, and emulation of rules, regulations, constitutions in something that was a normative or regulatory cascade, and in which we participated in the emulation and repetition of the transplant of those rules. And in Peter's book, and this is my recommendation for my students to read the book, is an explanation of why movements had little to do with the regulations or rules that were being transplanted or multiplicated, but rather with the internal psycho-emotional feeling that the movement created between the movers, that is, the participants of the movement that were being moved by the movement and moving the movement, both things at the same time. And these contributions seem to me important, but at the same time, very new. Though the very idea of movement suggests this type of psycho-emotional commitment, however, our understanding in the reception of those movements, the human rights movement, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, was taken as an object, as a thing that happened, without the internal descriptions that Peter was trying to make from the American 60s. This idea of not a legal movement, but rather a social, a psychological, and emotional movement in which Peter wants to rescue the love, the internal love that united the people that resisted the mood and the separation between one another. This idea is elementary in a way, but it's very innovative in our way of understanding how it is that these things get replicated in the global space of the law or social change. And one thing that I saw is that we here in Latin America have a lot of movements. I participated in some of them in the student movement of 1990-91 that somehow participated in the enactment of the 1991 Colombian Constitution, and later in, say, the feminist movement. But at the same time, again, this dissonance between the thing that the movement wants to achieve without the rich texture that Peter was trying to recreate from the 60s and in the United States. So this book is about how movements can be a place in which love between the members of the movement can, the word that he uses in English is very beautiful, ricochet. This idea that there can be a reproduction, un rebote constante, a constant ricochet of love between the people who participate in social, political, legal movements, and that the idea that the internal emotional mechanisms do count for much of what happens inside them. And that seems to be a right corrective for this type of objects, the movement, the regulatory replication of ideas or rules that actually let us talk about one of the recent movements in Latin America has been, for example, the idea of a reform in criminal procedure, a reform that is connected to a more disciplinarian state, but the movement seems to be connected with a more disciplinarian state that needs to somehow react to crimes in the region through the importation of new designs in criminal procedure. And that has been called also a movement as part, again, of the reception of this idea. The second thing that I want to praise in the book is that the book invites us to have different experiments or experiences with reconnecting with the others. The book wants us to think really strongly about the idea of being present to each other, the idea of presence, which is really used in contemporary meditative traditions, the idea of being present to each other. You won't be surprised then that Eckhart Tolle is cited in the book through one of the sort of contemporary gurus of the reception in the Western of the idea of being present and presence. So the book invites us to experiment with different mechanisms that reestablish the presence, the love between each other. And that's a very interesting contribution to a legal political field that is characterized by distance, professional distance, and that distance is actually praised and celebrated. I was reading recently an article on contemporary feminism, and one of the main messages that was that women were somehow getting the sour fruits in social and political movements, because according to the person that wrote this article, women were more approachable, more lovable, and somehow were more connected to the others. And the recommendation in this particular piece was that if women wanted to advance in their careers, they needed to somehow shift the poles of their approachability, availability to others, and to become more competitive and more distant to the others within the movement, Peter. So it was an article that wanted to talk about gender differences within the movement, in which, again, the movement and the right advancement of professional women within the movement was somehow advanced through distance, non-approachability, and non-availability. And again, the book invites us to experience the idea of love, of presence, again, to the others. I'll share, if I may, my screen. One of them, let me see. Try again. I'm trying to.
Lisa.
Well, it's not here. In chapter 1 of the book, Peter has this photograph by Peter Bergman.
Robert Bergman, yeah.
Sorry, Robert Bergman. And I wanted to show it in color, in full color, because it is particularly beautiful and striking. And he invited us through several pages simply to stare at the picture and try to connect with the woman who was whose picture here, trying to feel her presence and the beauty of her facial characteristics and the persona and the spirit that seems to inhabit here. So the book has these types of exercises that were extremely provocative for me, and I hope that they'll be provocative also for the readers in an exercise to bring down the bridge over the moat instead of simply digging it further and creating further trenches of separation. And again, this idea seems to be extremely useful for a new generation of legal students who try to be from the clinics that, for example, Daniel and Manuel have at the Universidad de los Andes. And it seems to be a very important complement to these contemporary efforts at social justice to recreate the internal emotional space that those movements are supposed to create. And it seems to me, Daniel and Manuel, a corrective to the tasks that we embarked upon without sort of thinking enough, at least in my case. I'm not saying yours, because certainly you're much more thoughtful than I am, but thinking more thoroughly about the internal psycho-emotional or psycho-spiritual tone that the movement itself is creating. These two concepts are very important in Peter: psycho-emotional and psycho-spiritual. And he's trying to help us imagine the spiritual tone that those movements can have in our practice as either legal or social reformers. I'll stop there. I want to simply thank again Peter for giving me the opportunity to translate the book, and I simply want to commend it to our students to read it, because it seems to me that it is social theory that is extremely useful for us. It's an approach, it's an approximation that it's novel. It's an intergenerational dialogue between Peter and the 60s and the hippies that wanted to change the world, and the very many lessons of that effort that many of us and many of our students are still trying to recreate without the fake environment of the 60s that, of course, exists no more, but still demands of us our ability to draw down the bridge and cross over the moat. Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Professor Gabel, do you have any reactions? I guess you do, to Professors Kennedy and Professor Lopez comments?
Oh, well, I thought they were both fantastic in their way. Duncan locating me in objectively in time and space, and Diego beautifully capturing what it is that I'm trying to do from the inside. Establishing the spiritual tone that can lay down the bridge between people. So I do have many reactions to the substance that each of them conveyed. I didn't write them each down though as they were talking, partly because I'm on my little phone and I don't have any devices here to do it with. Let's see. So I think maybe we should just open it to questions. I embrace what both of them said as both in both their positive and critical aspects. Let's open it to questions.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel raised his hand, and after Daniel, Luisa Castañeda. You can take those two questions.
Thank you, Manuel. If it's okay with you, perhaps Luisa can go first.
Do you want to go first, Luisa?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this interesting event. I am doing my PhD and I'm studying about the indigenous peoples movement and Colombia, but I'm focusing on the indigenous people of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, Professor Peter. And I just found about your book like 2 days ago, and I knew about this event, so I intend to read it. But from what I have heard today about you and the other professors, I was wondering, because you picture this book, this narrative in North America in this specific time, but you know, if I want to bring this discussion to now and specifically in Colombia, when you were talking about the reconnecting spirituality and trying to connect, you know, so what it resonates a lot with what indigenous peoples do actually, but that's what they do, no? They want to have the positionality in their discourse, in the narrative, especially when it comes to defend their territory, the lands, and the cosmogony, you know, and how they try to bring, you know, this vision of the world to they have dialogues with other actor. So I wanted to know when you were like writing this and because this is not new. It's happening in the US, in Canada, Latin America, Asia, Africa, no? This indigenous people movement that also has led to a significant legal recognition of the rights. So I wanted to have just your insights and to know what you think about it and how you will connect it to your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. We can go with Daniel and then back to Professor Gabel.
Thank you, Manuel. Peter, I would like to ask you two questions. The first one is about the link between the individual and the social, and the concept of the social, and more precisely of the social movement that you use, the concept from where your reflections of mutual recognition start from. So when you talk about the social movement, it seems that you understand it as the aggregation of the individuals that constitute. There are many members that are part of this movement, and the summatory of their decisions and actions is what constitutes the social movement. And if we want a social movement to be virtuous, to be effective, to materialize our longing for mutual recognition, so every member, each member of the social movement should recognize the other. But then perhaps we can also think about social movements in different ways. We can think that a social movement is a subject, a collective subject. And in that sense, then it seems that the social movement is something different from its members. If that is the case, if this is a plausible way of thinking about the social movement, then how mutual recognition and the process of recognizing each other would work? Right? It seems that this collective aspect of the social movement and of mutual recognition is in the margins of your reflections. And the second question is about the differences between the social movements of the 60s and 70s, in which many of your reflections are based on, and contemporary social movements. Of course, there are some continuities, but there are also discontinuities between those social movements and today's social movements. I think it's arguable that in the 60s and 70s, many, certainly not all, of social movements were more wide, in the sense that the aims were wider. The emancipation of humanity, the emancipation of a class, emancipation of all cultural minorities. Well, now, an important part, certainly not all social movements, but an important part of social movements are identity-based. And within each social movement, there's a lot of fragmentation. If that is the case, if my description of the differences between social movements in the 60s and 70s and social movements today is correct, how would you translate your reflections with regard to mutual recognition to today's situation and today's political field within which social movements work?
Thank you, Daniel.
Should I answer those? All those lot in there. Would you like me to answer those?
Yes, please.
I think I'll come to yours last, Lisa, on in the practices of indigenous people. Let me start with Daniel's and then wind back to yours. In my way of seeing things, the book makes a big point of saying the book is not an assertion, but an appeal. So, in other words, the knowledge that I'm claiming in answering a question like this is an appeal that you may disagree with, based on my best efforts to illuminate the world as I see it. And so here what I would say is that there is no individual in the sense that you were using the word, Daniel, the aggregation of individuals forming the social movement. In my view, in my way of seeing things, there is a relational bond among all human beings. And here I am talking about something generated out of every interaction, out of the core of every human being born in relationship to others and others. That is a spiritual force that either permeates the social, in the creation of what's called movement. There's a permeation of that spiritual force through the ricochet, as Diego put it, that should be radiant within the movement itself. So the idea of a social movement separate from that force is, it's in a way, it's sort of a contradiction, but the main point is that when that happens, if the social movement becomes an objectified entity, that when you called it a collective subject, well, then we have to give it subjectivity. And to me, the subjectivity is in the radiance of the ricochet of recognition from one person to another, sometimes can be to millions of people almost all at once, that spreads very rapidly, something like the speed of light at a spiritual level, that spontaneously awakens in the other an opening up of the heart. And this, so my answer to you on that first point is that there is no separation between, that the individual in movement in relation to others forms the social subject of which you were speaking. The second point about contemporary movements versus the sort of 60s movements on which the book was based, I accept that characterization, and yet I want to be sure that the book isn't, I wouldn't say dismissed, but marginalized as a creation of the 60s period. Because what I feel I am describing is something awakened in the movements of the 60s that has universal significance. And therefore, even in very different particular settings, you know, there may be a time that, to refer to something that Diego said, that women need to be more professional in movements and less open. That doesn't invalidate that may be the way for establishing relations of equality and power that becomes a basis for the next manifestation of the deeper wisdom of the women's movement. I don't think that's what your article, Diego, was actually saying from the way you described it, but it could be so. So what I'm saying is that the particular may always vary. The universal is the radiant energy of the human's longing, social longing for recognition with the other. And so in today's movements, you know, it's a very good discussion whether these are movements or how to define the various struggles that people are engaging in today. Certainly they have not broken out of the confines of their particularity into the wider culture. They haven't found a way to generate from each particular movement effort a universal evocation that can draw other people into it and make people feel a part of it. So I would say that the lesson of the book for these movements is recover that capacity for evocation of the transcendent community that the particular struggle is always based on. The particular struggle over race or women's issues, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender issues. Every one of these particular struggles emerges out of an aspiration to recognition, liberation, full humanity that can realize itself only through this kind of universal transcendent appeal. It can battle away within the liberal framework for more rights, probably originating, almost certainly originating in a spiritual impulse like the one that I was just describing. Every one of these movements was born of a common spiritual impulse. That's what made them move. The uprising in a similar period of all these different movements at the same time is that what I'm saying is that there was an oxygen in the air that made it possible for each particular movement to come into existence. It may, as Duncan was describing, descend into bureaucratization, battling only for new regulations or rights. It may involve a loss of touch with the deeper evocative link, sorry for going on so long, between the deeper evocative link between the particular suffering and longing in a particular movement and what all human beings long for, the universal message that could be expressed through these movements. So bottom line, modern day movements need to discover an evocative discourse and way of manifesting themselves that reaches out to all others and seeks to draw them in against all the resistance that will inevitably occur. Oh, and Lisa, I have nothing but interest in indigenous spiritual practices. I don't know them well enough. The one strong example in my history is the civil rights movement and the relationship between the spirituality of the Black church, the call and the use of call and response, the liveliness of the sermon, call and response from the audience, gospel singing, all of the things that elevated the collective spirit of that community, of the Black community, that then led them to pour out into the streets when they poured out over a period of many, many years, I mean, and exert a moral claim on the wider authority that could lead to the changes that they were aspiring to. Now, of course, that's gotten lost somewhat in the liberal rights framework that tends to absorb and co-opt. That's the higher transcendent spiritual aspirations. But so I would say I hope you write up in the course of your PhD, Lisa, how the spirituality of the indigenous peoples advances and deepens the meaning of what it is that they are fighting for, and how that can be a basis for reaching out to the dominant culture in which there are millions of people waiting to be liberated if they could find a pathway out.
Thank you very much, Professor Gabel. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. It's almost 3:30. I don't know if you have a final question or comment for Professor Gabel. Manuel.
A follow-up, Peter. With regard to the first question, the connection between the individual and the collective, and the idea that the collective, or more precisely the collective social movement, is not a subject in itself, but it's constituted mainly by individuals. I wonder, when we talk about the nation or the people, or indigenous groups talk about the collectivity, if we are not using the idea of the social, of the collectivity in a different way, right? Thinking that it is not only constituted by individuals, but that it has a subjectivity that we should recognize and value. And if that is the case, if we find something valuable in this way of speaking about different types of subjectivities, individual and collective, then perhaps it might be useful to think about mutual recognition in this setting, right? Should we talk about the mutual recognition of nations, of peoples, of indigenous groups, communities, right? Thinking that many people do think that, well, these collectivities are entities in themselves, and that they have intrinsic value.
There is an ambiguity in the nature of the nation as a collective. In one aspect, it's a manifestation of the false we. I gave my Donald Trump example there of Make America Great Again. It can, in other moments, be an expression of authentic mutual recognition coming to be linked with a nationality, like the Cuban Revolution or the current Ukrainian struggle of resistance. In other words, so what I'm saying is that there's an ambiguity in the idea of the nation, which it is often a imaginary substitute for the real thing. And so in that situation, the concept of mutual recognition between countries, it's still valuable. It still can be valuable. Certainly after the Oslo Accords, when there was some mutual recognition between Israel and Palestine, that was a great moment. Of course, that was enlivened by quite a lot of spirituality too, but that was a great moment in which what you're talking about took place in a discourse that suggested we need to recognize one another as human beings. But it's at a collective cognitive level, as opposed to at the level of actually feeling that, experiencing it, identifying with the radiant energy of the feeling itself. So let's just say, good question, that's worth trying to discuss how that could be so. Can I close by reading the last paragraph of my book?
Of course, please do that.
It is natural enough from the standpoint of our fear within our mutually withdrawn locations to feel that such an unqualifiedly idealistic vision of the possibilities for social life are unrealistic. But if you take a moment to sit calmly with yourself and to feel your own needs inside yourself and the longings in your own heart for the world you actually want, and if you then let yourself realize that every other human being on the planet is an incarnation of the very same essential being that is present in you and longs for precisely what you long for, then you may see that such a hopeful vision is simply the realization of who we already are in unrealized form. From birth, we have expected to live in such a loving world, and we have already been trying to bring it into being in every moment, in every interaction with another. In this book, I have sketched out some of the obstacles that have limited our success thus far. But as you look up from the book and turn toward the next person who comes into your field of sight, you will extend yourself toward him or her with the same desire for mutual recognition, for mutuality of presence that is occurring everywhere among all of us as social human beings. If this is our universal longing and aspiration that pulses through us in every human interaction, then only we ourselves are preventing ourselves from realizing it. And yet the paradox that has stymied us thus far has been that we can only do so by releasing each other from the enclosure that reciprocally contains us. Once we truly come to know together that we together hold the key to each other's liberation. And once we find the social and political path to spread this collective awareness sufficiently across social space, then the loving world to which we aspire will begin to be born. And I did conclude saying, you may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Thank you for letting me read that.
Thank you so much, Professor Gabel, for such an uplifting conversation. And thank you to everyone who attended, especially Professor Kennedy and Professor Lopez. And also thank you, Daniel, for your comments, and Luisa. So we'll see you next time. Take care and love each other.